Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 3rd of February 2020, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me today by video link is David Scott. Welcome to the programme, David.
Pleased to be here, Mike.
That made a bit of a mistake there, but anyway, let's get on. We're going to get straight on, David, with Brexit because phase two is in action. We've done the divorce, and now we're doing the future relationship. Michel Barnier is leading this. He said he wants to put forward a highly ambitious trade deal, zero tariffs, zero quota deal on goods, and an ambitious deal on services. He said that there would be wide sector coverage on services, including digital trade and intellectual property. But he said that the exceptional trade deal is conditional. So it's possible if competition is and remains open and fair. It's possible if fisheries remain open to the EU for all breeds of fish. And he said that there is a sustainable enforcement mechanism required in order to deal with this trade deal or create a trade deal. He didn't specify exactly what that meant, whether that meant, in fact, that we're looking at the European Court of Justice as the final arbiter of this trade deal. This isn't clear yet. He said there'd be no mutual recognition of rules after the transition period, and that means there'll be no passporting in the banking sector, that goods entering the EU would be subject to regulatory checks, so customs checks, and he said that there are automatic and mechanical consequences of the UK's choices. Businesses must adapt now or else, basically. He is then talking about the fact that there's going to be a security framework for the exchange of data, cooperation in police matters, defence, and so on. Again, of course, nothing specified in great detail just yet because the negotiation really hasn't begun. Now it's going to begin as soon as there's ratification of Barnier's proposals that were presented this morning. I think on the 20th of February that will happen. Boris got involved because he then subsequently had his own briefing. Boris says, well, not very much, actually. He gave a typical Boris presentation, lots of bonhomie and good humour and so on. He said that he wants to negotiate trade deals with countries that the UK has turned its back on since the 1970s. He said that conspiracy theorists should accept that the NHS will not be on the table in trade talks with the United States. And he said that the UK will maintain food hygiene and animal welfare standards. So one of the things that Barnier was absolutely clear about was that if the UK wanted to have things like passporting in the banking sector and so on, that there would have to be regulatory parity in the future. Well, Boris is saying that the UK will maintain food hygiene and animal welfare standards. He said that the UK will not engage in some cutthroat race to the bottom. We're not leaving the EU to undermine standards. And he said that the UK is also ahead of the EU in legislating to cut carbon emissions. He made a big deal of the fact that Barnier was demanding that the UK fall into line or continue in line with EU standards. But then he was suggesting that in fact the UK is ahead on many standards and that the EU should not be demanding this. He really didn't have very much specific to say, David. Barnier did have some pretty clear specifics to say. The press in the UK so far, some of the Brexit press anyway, suggesting that he was continuing with his threats. But what's really clear, if you sort of read between the lines of both these presentations, is that there's positioning being set out. We're basically looking at least one more year of the same type of to and fro rhetoric that we had in the run up to the divorce deal.
Yes, and presumably it'll all be last minute as well. And so Boris is going on carbon emissions. I mean, it's a complete nothing non-entity of a hoax. We don't care, right? I mean, please stop, ruining our industries because of it, and ruining our wildlife and scenery because of it. by covering everything in wind turbines and solar panels, but we don't really care. And apart from that, yeah, you're saying, well, what did Boris say? Barnier, right, zero tariff, zero quota, fine. I don't know how much enforcement you have if it's just zero, for someone just to check it's zero, that's good. The fisheries is an obvious fight and a strange one for the EU, because when we joined the EU, they never really had any fisheries policy before they had Britain. And they could have made it up in the hoof and said, well, it's ours. And we could have gave into this. And it was a con, even in 1972 or whenever it was. And they're trying to double down on that. That's an interesting hill to choose to die on. Now, can we do a deal? Well, I'm sure we can. I don't imagine we're going to ban every single European boat from British waters. There might be some way where they could pay for access, but I don't suppose that's what Barney's got in mind.
Well, no, and in fact, Boris said that he wants, one of the few things that he did say, he said he wants a deal on fish, but it has to respect the fact that the UK is an independent coastal state controlling its own waters. Well, of course, if there's a deal in place and terms are agreed, well, actually, what has changed? Has the UK not always been controlling its own waters, even under the Common Fisheries Policy? I think Brian would tell you, as he mentioned on Friday's programme, that well, he was part of that situation as running a fisheries protection ship at one point. So, what's actually changing? It just seems to me, David, that well, we're being brought into. We've had the divorce, we're being brought into the future relationship. What difference will there actually be? Well, not very much actually. And really, I'm just going to summarize it like this, because we've all seen Godfather 3. Just when I thought I was out, they dragged me back in. This is pretty much where it is increasingly looking to end up. With both these presentations, we're going to have positions, we're going to negotiate a deal, but effectively, we're going to agree to opt in to whatever it is that we want to opt in. This is very much like David Cameron's position in 2015, and I really wonder how it's any different.
We need some really abrasive negotiating people in there for a while. We've got a year, right? I mean, there's nothing going to actually happen until the last 3 months. So we get someone who's really annoying in there for 9 months and cause some havoc. Has the EU accepted we're independent?
No.
No, this is it. They have to make this psychological shift before we can negotiate. We have to have someone in there pushing for that psychological shift. And finally, on the subject of fishing, I'm not sure that the Royal Navy and Whitehall bureaucrats are the people who should be managing our fishing waters. I rather think the fishermen could do a fine job.
I think that's a very good point. Okay, well, look, let's move on. Well, we've got some good news, because already begun is Exercise Defender Europe 20. Well, British Army is taking part in this. This is a huge NATO exercise. It's going to include about 2,500 UK personnel. They're going to deploy from the UK in a series of linked activities that comprise Defender Europe 20. Activities are planned to occur from February. Well, in fact, they've already begun, because some logistical elements of the exercise began on the 21st of January. This is the largest deployment of troops from the United States to Europe since the Reforger exercises during the Cold War. Well, they're going to plan a workshop for Defender Europe in Warsaw. They've run that, sorry. And well, here is the wonderful US ambassador to Poland, who says that this exercise is not just symbolic, it gets to the heart of what we mean when we talk about collective European security. She said, in a crisis, NATO must be able to respond as quickly as possible. Defender Europe 20 is simply could not happen without Poland. So here is the map of what they're intending to do. This looks to me, David, all about mobility, and we're looking at port and maritime ops, heavy lift capability, convoy support center, medical hospital. If we look on this map at the various things, helicopters with the US, we're looking at 37,000 total participants, 20,000 US participants, 2,500 UK participants, 2,000 Polish participants, including heavy equipment and air forces, plus the Polish police, fire department and border guard will also be involved. So here again, we have this idea mooted jointly by NATO and the European Union that we should have military and civilian infrastructure and institutions operating together. Well, just to put this in a little bit of perspective, I want to highlight this article here from William Arkin. It's an exclusive in Newsweek. While the press and public focus on Iran, US military prepares for war with Russia. And what they're saying is that basically out of 93 exercises, that NATO exercises took place last year, all 93 were aimed at Russia. He said that these persistent heel-to-toe operations, as the military calls them, where one exercise begins as another ends, emphasize rapid aircraft deployments and dispersal to forward bases. Much of the emphasis last year was on fighter aircraft and bomber scatterings, showing Western geographic advantage, while also demonstrating combined air operations refined in 20 years of Middle East fighting. So 50,000 NATO and allied military personnel were in drills and activity against Russia, he said. US Air Force F-35 fighters deployed to both Finland and Norway for the first time. And he talked about the 6 B-52s, which were deployed to the UK and flew practice missions over the Baltic and the Black Sea. He said over 5 months from May until the end of September, those 93 military exercises were held in and around 29 countries. So I don't know what your thoughts are on this, but there's been a lot of noise with Brexit, with what's going on in the Middle East, and all the way through it. And we've tried to highlight as many of these NATO exercises as we could on this program all the way through last year. The focus always on Russia, David.
It is, and it's bizarre because surely we're looking for peace, right? The best thing is no war, right? That's the reason we build up a military, is to deter aggressors, so that we never have to use the military. And the weaker you are, the more likely you are to be attacked. So the whole reason for spending on the military is not just to protect your nation if it's attacked, but to deter attacks in the first place. But that also means maintaining relationships with other countries so that there's an exchange of ideas and information and problems are diffused. So we've decided, someone on our behalf has decided, that Russia's the great enemy, the great threat, the new Soviet Union, despite the fact that's not true. We might eventually make it true if we keep pushing them, but it's not true at the moment. So what's going to happen is we're going to eventually so threaten Russia that Russia will be forced to rearm, reorganize, and that will be viewed as yet more evidence of Russian aggression.
But hasn't that already happened?
Yes, and what's Russia already done? Right, it's occupied the Crimea, which was part of Russia for most of its history, and where the people wanted to be part of Russia. And despite the fact it's been trumpeted as this illegal occupation, it's not. It's simply a political ploy to pressure Russia, to call it that. They've supported Syria to maintain Syrian independence against Western and Middle Eastern inspired insurgents to overthrow a government and cause civil war and absolute mayhem. So what Russia has done in Syria has helped bring peace and promote fewer people being dead. I think this is a good thing. So Russia's recent record has actually been, rather good. And what do we point to then? We would point to the Salisbury attack. So why Russia? Russia because we need an enemy, because we need to build up the military. Where is this going? It's only going one place. It's going to conflict. This is not in our interests.
Indeed. Well, we'll come on to some more of this later on. Now, David, let's have a look at this. Gilad Atzmon has published an article about, well, he's being intimidated, harassed.
Yes, this is very interesting. Now, the campaign against anti-Semitism is the subject of this. So Gilad's published an article yesterday, and he's saying he hopes for an end to intimidation, harassment, and bullying. Now, I've experienced the intimidation, harassment, and bullying that that Gilad has to put up with firsthand, as we were attacked in Edinburgh with some Edinburgh Antifa, and we've had some hassle getting places to talk about his book. So it goes like this. Gilad gets a venue. In this case, they're attacking his music, his ability to earn a living. So that's how it's done. They can't defeat the argument, so they attack his ability to earn a living. So Gilad goes and gets a gig. He's a jazz musician, very fine jazz musician. And then the campaign against anti-Semitism targets the club. So they're now talking about picketing the 606 Club, which is a jazz club in London, over its decision to provide notorious anti-Semite Gilad Atzmon with a platform. Right now, notorious anti-Semite Gilad Atzmon, they have a problem with, because Gilad tours in places where anti-Semitism is extremely illegal, like Germany, and has no trouble because no one can point to a single word he's said or written that's actually anti-Semitic. And the fact that he's ethnically Jewish as well, you know, it's a very strange charge, but this is the charge. And because it's so toxic, it's been working because people react in horror. People say, "Oh, it's a notorious anti-Semite. Oh, maybe we shouldn't have him here." And people run in fear from this smear, lie, and they are now targeting him and anyone who works with him and any organisation that allows him to work and earn a living with the same message. Because if you support Gilad Atzmon, you become a notorious anti-Semite yourself, and this is how they go on. So this campaign of harassment by the CAA is now coming under proper scrutiny.
Okay, so Gilad had a couple of things to say here. First one, such threats are an anathema to the values of British and Western culture. The way to counter ideas with which they don't agree is to present their own position. The tactic of gross intimidation, of menacing an entire community over the legal speech of one member, are more characteristic of organised crime than of a British charity. Now, so this is a charity then?
This is a charity. Now, this is another thing that people are starting to look at. So wait a minute, this is a charity. They're getting special tax breaks from the British government for being a charity. So they've now been reported. So here you see a tweet from Ashara Ali. Campaign against anti-Semitism is under investigation by the Charities Commission following referral by a Green Party Home Affairs spokesperson. So the Green Party, presumably because they're raising the issue of Palestinians, have faced similar smears, and they've reported this to the Charities Commission. So it'll be very interesting to see what the Charities Commission do with a charity that is breaking the law, targeting individuals for harassment, and trying to destroy people's livelihoods because they don't agree with what they have to say on Palestine or any other issue, even though what they're saying and doing is entirely lawful. It becomes a question: are we a law-abiding country? Do we respect the law? And if so, do we protect people who might say things which perhaps are unpopular or controversial, or do we let the wolves get them? Well, I'm all for protecting people. So Gilad went to the police. Where do you go for protection in this country? You go to the police. So he says here, yesterday I reported the CAA's actions to the police. They took my complaint very seriously. I was interviewed for 2 hours. I had a strong impression that the matter was already known to the police. And he concluded, I was advised that every musician, music venue, promoter, or audience member who is or has been subject to any intimidation or harassment by the CAA should contact the police immediately. And I just want to emphasize that's lawful action. That's a lawful response to being harassed. Nothing's been taken into anyone's own hands. There's no violence. Contact the police immediately. So anyone who has gone along to a Gilad Atzmon concert and suffered this sort of intimidation, please do that.
Now, of course, anti-Semitism and the accusations of anti-Semitism have had quite a lot of press in the last 12 or 18 months because of the Jeremy Corbyn situation and the Labour Party situation. But it's not just anti-Semitism or at least the allegations of anti-Semitism that are a problem. So let's just briefly discuss the situation with Alastair Stewart, the UK newsreader that has been forced to resign from his job at ITN as a result of something that he pushed out on social media.
Yes, this is Fraser Nelson writing in the Telegraph. The headline is from Alastair Stewart to Scruton: the public are fighting back against the cancel culture of the digital mob. And he says the backlash against ITN's ousting of Alastair Stewart shows the dangers of firms embracing moral panic. Now, he goes on to look at the case of Roger Scruton. Now, Roger Scruton, we didn't actually cover this at the time, but Roger Scruton recently passed away. He's someone that we've quoted. I personally quoted in some of the articles I've done for the column. He's was a very fine thinker and conservative commentator and philosopher, and a very gentle and thoughtful man. Very like Gillard Atzmon, actually, in many ways, although the politics are completely different. He was hounded out. So the Telegraph writes here, at the time of his death, Sir Roger Scruton was celebrated not just one of the greatest philosophers of his lifetime, but as someone who was able to defy and expose the mob. A Twitter storm had erupted over words of his that had been maliciously twisted, and within hours he had been fired from his role chairing a government commission. But his treatment led to uproar and his eventual reinstatement. Yet again he made history. For once, the mob did not get its man. Right, and he goes on now to compare this situation with Alastair Stewart. He said Alastair Stewart was dropped by ITN for making what it called errors of judgment on social media. He'd been quoting Shakespeare, citing lines from Measure for Measure that included the words angry ape. The person he'd been debating with was black, and a daft row ensued. It ought to have ended at most in an apology where Stewart would have made the obvious point that no offence was intended. Instead, it ended his 40 years career. How ridiculous is that? So I was interested as to who the person he was arguing with actually was. And it was this gentleman here, Mr. Martin Shapland. He's a policy manager at the Institution of Civil Engineers, of which I'm a member, actually. So I might have one or two questions for them. So his LinkedIn profile describes him as a professional with a background in campaigns, communications, policy and research, working in Parliament and for volunteer organisations, skilled in lobbying, briefing, press and media handling. Okay, and he's a policy manager for the Institution of Civil Engineers. He was Parliamentary Affairs Officer for MENCAP, a parliamentary researcher for 6 years, and a caseworker for John Hemming MP. It's amazing how the same names keep coming up. But people have been looking at his social media, and it's not very good, because he's saying things about white people, effing white privilege here. This panel, he's talking about a panel here discussing an issue. This panel is so rich and so white, it's basically cheesecake. So I'm a little surprised that is the sort of profile that the Institution of Civil Engineers and its fine headquarters in 1 Great George Street is wanting to be associated with. But I very much hope he doesn't lose his job over the fact that he's showing obvious anti-white racism on social media, because that doesn't necessarily mean he can't do his job. If he loses his job, it should be on his performance in that role. This hounding people out of jobs because they say they have an opinion that the mainstream doesn't agree with really ought to end, and we should make sure that it ends for everybody, not just people on our side of the fence.
Just before you move on there, David, of course, Alastair Stewart didn't lose his job for having an opinion. He lost his job because of a misinterpretation of Shakespeare, and that's a completely different thing.
Yes, Alastair Stewart didn't do anything. I mean, Gillard Atzmon says controversial things about Israeli policy with respect to the Palestinians. It's not anti-Semitic, right? He has reasons for everything he says, and it's an important discussion to have. But not everyone will agree, and they are controversial. I don't know that quoting Shakespeare is that controversial. But you see, once someone like Gillard loses the ability to speak, essentially everyone loses the ability to speak.
Yeah.
That everything becomes weaponized, and as soon as you cross some invisible tripwire, you're gone, and your career is gone. Now, just as a small aside, we recently published an article on the whole monkey accusation called "Who Are You Calling a Monkey?" This was in response to football chants and monkey sounds from crowds in football stadiums. Nothing to do with Shakespeare quotes from elderly, respected broadcasters, but it does go into what the issue is and my personal view as to why that sort of approach is wrong. But it shows a reason for it. It's not just a case of being PC and not offending. It actually shows on a deep and fundamental level it's wrong and why. And my argument is we should have some principles about these things and work from those principles to create a better way of treating our fellow man, not just intimidate people if they say things we don't like.
Indeed. Right, now let's move on to a bit of Scottish news. Well, first of all, it's not it's taking place in Scotland, but this is related to the climate change issue. COP26 is going to be taking place in Glasgow in September. I'm sure, David, you're really looking forward to that. Well, the government appointed this lady, Claire Perry, she was nominated in September 2019 as the president of the 26th United Nations Climate Change Conference, which is being held in Glasgow later this year. So as a result, she decided that she would not stand for re-election to Parliament because she had been sitting as the Conservative MP for Devizes, I believe. So she gave up her seat for the general election at the general election in December last year. But sadly, she has now been sacked as the president of COP26. So the government announced today that she'll no longer be the COP26 president. The Prime Minister apparently is grateful to Claire for her work, preparing for what is going to be a very successful and ambitious climate change summit in Glasgow. Preparations will continue at pace for the summit, and a replacement will be confirmed shortly, and that's going to be a ministerial role apparently from now on. So she's now threatening to sue the government, David, because effectively she was given a job and she resigned from another job in order to take that job, and has managed to get herself sacked within a couple of months of taking the job, and she thinks that that's been a bit unfair. But on the broader issue, I guess you are particularly excited about the fact that COP26 will be taking place in Glasgow, and you'll be there, no doubt.
Oh, I'm sure I'll pop along to see all of the excitement of very, very rich people flying in to tell us why we shouldn't fly airplanes and things like this. It'll be wonderful, but at least it's in summer, so it won't be snowed off, and that's good news because we used to get that wrong and have them in places like Copenhagen in the winter, and it didn't go well.
Yeah, sorry, I just need a quick correction there. It's not September, it's November it's taking place. So you might have snow, but Greta will be there, and hopefully you'll be able to get an autograph for us. Now let's move on to Nippy and Brexit. And at the weekend, well, Nicola Sturgeon wasn't really having much fun.
But I was. Oh, it made my weekend. This was so funny. I spent the entire weekend laughing. The Brexit, I don't know if you had a good Brexit day, Mike. I had a blast because, and I have to thank her for this, Nicola Sturgeon made it hilariously funny because she said in the lead up to the Brexit announcement, on Brexit Day, on the lead up to the 11 o'clock leaving of the EU, she was going to have a major announcement, a major speech charting the way forward on independence, a statesman-like, profound speech. So she and all the nationalists got excited about this, and there was MPs tweeting that they were very excited. They didn't know what was in the speech, and it's very exciting because they didn't know what was coming, and it's going to be huge. And those of us who follow these things in Scotland knew it wasn't going to be huge because statesman-like isn't in Nicola's range. And she stood up there and waffled on with a lot of stuff we'd heard before. And about the only new thing was she was going to go to the Electoral Commission to check if the question is still legal. It's not, but she's going to go and ask them anyway. And that's it. And we're going to do some more hearts and minds stuff and blah, blah, blah. There was nothing. It was a damp squib. The first thing that happened is Fatboy Slim, Ian Blackford, tweeted out the usual automatic response to Nicola's speech of support, how wonderful this was, and was set on by hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of angry nationalists talking about how much they'd been betrayed. The Wings website that we've covered before actually called Nicola Sturgeon the betrayer, right? The rage was palpable. And this was all to do with this her inability to deal with Brexit. Essentially, that was what was driving it. So Jim Sillars, who's one of the wisest voices in the Scottish national movement, in the Scottish independence movement, he's been reported in the Telegraph. He said that the SNP must stop acting like Brussels' fifth column after Nicola Sturgeon's referendum capitulation, which is a fair summary of where we're at. And he goes on here, there will be no second referendum until there's an overwhelming demand for it and until Brexit is done and digested. In other words, sense, right? That's the truth of the matter. And he continued, the independence movement must reconsider the relationship with the SNP, especially in light of the error-strewn course taken by its leaders, with no strategic nous out of their depth, which is almost word for word the sort of stuff I was tweeting. This is, I'm completely in agreement with them. This is the problem. There is no leadership. They're completely at sea. And the Sunday Post also reported comments from Mr. Sillars, talking about reconsidering the independence movement should reconsider its ties with the SNP. And he comes up here with a key phrase. He said, former Deputy Leader Jim Sillars said the independence movement should distance itself from the party as he accused Nicola Sturgeon of monumental political misjudgment. And that is absolutely spot on.
And well, if his advice was taken, who would the independence movement align themselves with?
Oh, this is the problem. This is well, one of many problems. I came up with an almost identical phrase independently from Mr. Sillars over the weekend. I was calling it a fatal strategic error, because in choosing to align the Scottish national movement with Europe, right, which is an anti-national, anti-nation superstate, A, she's made the whole thing ridiculous. B, she's also chosen to align for short-term political gain the Scottish national movement with everything anti-British. So she's therefore split Scotland, right, with the majority opposing her, because we're not anti-British, we're British. Right? And rather, the Jim Sillars approach is to find something that's harmonious, and he sees a way forward where we no longer govern from Westminster. I'm sure many people in England could think, well, okay, I can see where you're coming from, but without any of this anti-British bigotry. So what Nicola's doing is making the whole thing divisive and making most of the Scots oppose her and dividing the nation. It's a horrendous miscalculation. And then she's spent 3.5 years arguing against nations being able to be independent and saying we must be part of this bigger trading bloc, as if the EU is just that, or otherwise we're doomed. So she's argued consistently in favour of unionism and against independence and against countries being able to be independent, and about all the horrible things that will happen if Britain becomes independent from the EU for 3 or 4 years. And now she turns around to the Scots after Brexit goes through and says, look, we need to be part of this EU. We're going to leave. We're going to rejoin the EU. And that's no easy number. We're going to have whatever trade barriers that the EU imposed between us and England, which is 60% of Scottish exports. It's nonsense. So she's put herself in a horrendous, she's put the whole independence movement in a horrendous position by opposing independence, opposing British independence, splitting the nation, and going down this anti-British, pro international globalist superstate line, rather than the line that used to be the Scottish National Party line, which is actual genuine independence in a country standing on its own feet.
I get everything that you're saying there, but I'm interested to try to understand why the SNP still seems to be able to do reasonably well in general elections or other elections. At what point is this that they are seen as the least worst option, or at what point are they going to start at an electoral level reaping the rewards of this rhetoric?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I think it will come. They have adopted everything that's toxic from the left, and they've stolen Labour's clothes, and that was the tactic. So the whole othering of the Tories, right? This was a Labour tactic to make the word Tory toxic, to make people ashamed to be Conservative, to win by making people unwilling to admit that they're Conservative, by making the other side of the argument unsayable. That was the tactic. It's postmodernism. It's the whole how to intimidate people thing. It's words as weapons, not as arguments. They took that on board from the Labour Party, and they've run with it. They've been even more effective than the Labour Party have. But now they've now got people writing Quisling on the outside of Scottish Conservative offices all around Scotland. It's horrendous. So they've built up this bitterness, and then they've allied themselves with things like Irish republicanism and anything that hates Britain, and they've assembled this kind of coalition of hatred for Britain, in addition to the mainstream of Scottish nationalism, which is something else. Scottish nationalism was never like that, or most of it wasn't like that. And they're also operating in a first past the post system, in a four-party system. So if you get a third of the vote, you get a wagon load of seats, and anything more than that, you get almost all the seats, because the vote's so subdivided. But eventually that will end. Things always do. And the problem's going to be that the movement will be in disarray when it does, because there's no, Jim Sillars and one or two others aside, there's no wise words, there's no leadership, and she's surrounded herself with the second rate, third rate, and fourth rate. Yeah. Thumbs up. You.
Okay, now just briefly on this one, if we can. This is from the Sunday Post as well. In Scotland, the £230 million ghost ships pictures expose shocking state of Scotland's super ferries. Now, can we just before we get into the meat of this subject, can we just qualify the term super ferry here?
Look, here we go. Right, we had a tender for some ferries, so we're going to be very advanced, and we're going to have multi-fuel, they're going to be very large, unusually large for the routes that we're running, and they were tendered, and there were 6 tenders, and the contract was awarded to the highest price bidder, which just happened to be essentially a startup business on the Clyde, run by an SNP supporting business tycoon. So that's how that one went down. It's not gone terribly well. The whole contract's massively over budget, something like a couple £100 million worth of overspend. The ferries are not finished. We have no ferries, and this is starting to look at the issues. I chose this as one of potentially 7 or 8 things I could have chosen about SNP mismanagement on the ground in Scotland and misgovernment. But this is just one example. So here you see they've had an expert look at this. Is a picture of one of the ferries, and they're highlighting here steel plates deformed and the frames behind visible. One naval architect described this as the hungry horse effect, because the ribs can be seen. The deformities demonstrate that the ship is structurally weak, according to experts, and also they highlight the corrosion problems, because the ships are sitting outside in the water or on the slipway, and in all weathers, and they are rusting. Original £97 million contract for 2 ferries. The government report published in December said another 110 million must be spent, and both ships won't be on the sea until 2022, on top of another 45 million of government loans, which are already written off. So we're looking at, we're getting on for 300 million here. Dr. Spyros Hadaris, maritime safety professor at Aalto University, Finland, said, "One thing that drew my attention immediately is the indentations on the side of the ship. I would not expect to see buckled plates on the side shell of a new ship." And they're also highlighting here the problems with the anti-fouling paint, which, because it's been sitting out for so long, the ship not moving, requires to be replaced. And finally, here's a photograph of the second ship. As you see, things are quite a long way from being finished. And another expert in marine consultancy is talking about the biggest issues, and the ships have been sitting out in the open for so long, and the amount of remedial work that will be needed. So it's so bad that after 100 and something million pounds, they're seriously looking at scrapping the ferries completely and starting again. Management of our infrastructure by the SNP.
Yes, good stuff. Okay, now let's just move on to coronavirus. We'll be glad to know that the government has now issued a public information statement on coronavirus. Similar, they say, to the Catch It, Bin It, Kill It campaign, which is used for flu and norovirus. It's promoting important hygiene practices, such as regularly washing hands and also always sneezing into a tissue. There's no mention of wet wipes in this, David, but tissues are mentioned. Well, this is what our illustrious Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, had to say. Basic hygiene, such as washing our hands regularly and using tissues when we cough and sneeze, can play an important role in minimising the spread of viruses like this. So this went alongside the announcement today of £20 million to develop new vaccines to combat what they're describing as the world's deadliest diseases, including the novel coronavirus. And so Matt Hancock was visiting Public Health England's Porton Down lab last week, and he said that the UK will ramp up efforts to fund groundbreaking research into vaccines, diagnostics and cures to fight against the the threat of future viruses. So no doubt you're feeling particularly safe and secure in that knowledge.
I have antibacterial hand gel. I am prepared.
Okay, good stuff. We will leave that one there. And we're just going to end on this because Plymouth City Council has announced that it intends to cut down all the trees in the city centre. And they're saying basically tough luck to anybody that doesn't like that, because they want to pedestrianise and improve the streets in the city centre. So that's going to involve removing and replacing a number of trees in the area. Many people in the local area are not terribly happy about that. They say the felling of these trees, which welcome visitors to the streets with a wonderful green vibrancy, will result in the loss of tree cover for birds and shade in the summer months. And we would just highlight the distinct possibility that this is a continuation of the programme to roll out 5G networks across the country. We're seeing this type of behaviour from city centres right across the UK to cut down trees because, of course, particularly wet leaves interfere with 5G signals. I don't know how much of this type of activity there is in Scottish cities so far, David.
Not too much so far. What's the official line that Plymouth Council are giving on this? What's the reason they state the trees are being removed?
They state that they want to pedestrianise and improve the area. That's all they're saying about it so far. And in order to do that, they've got to remove these trees. They're not really saying any more than that.
Can pedestrians not cope with trees?
No, apparently it's not possible to walk around them. They're just too big, and so they have to go. It is incredible that when we're talking about pollution constantly in the news media at the moment, when we're talking about climate change constantly in the news media, and the need to plant more trees, that city centres are removing them, we would suggest that there's a technological reason for that, and perhaps the whole furore over Huawei. It looks to me like that's a little bit diversionary and keep people looking in that direction while other stuff is going on. So we'll keep you posted on that and see how that campaign goes. The local campaigners have set up a petition against it, and we'll see how it goes. I think we'll leave it there for today. David, thank you very much for joining us. Any final comments?
Well, it's just, once again, we're seeing something happening down there in Plymouth, and it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any rational sense. The reasons offered are half-hearted and incomplete, and we're seeing this in all forms of government everywhere.
Absolutely. Well, look, thank you very much for joining me today. We will be back at the same time, 1 p.m. on Wednesday, and hope to see you then. Thanks for joining us. Bye-bye.